S.C.O.P.E. And hopefully, I think Drew passed around, or maybe all of you have this, and there's also like an insert in here, at least most of them had an insert about a symposium I'm giving on the free market at SUNY Buffalo on April 13th, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. What is S.C.O.P.E.? Well, S.C.O.P.E. is a grassroots gun rights organization. We keep people informed about legislation in New York State and how that affects people. There really is no, well, there's a sort of a little split. Like the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association is more active downstate, S.C.O.P.E. is more active upstate. There's some kind of rivalry that I've inherited from other people that had some sort of argument, and that's why it's set up that way. But not to put too much emphasis on that, but there is this sort of the upstate downstate thing going on here, which goes on in a lot of other places in New York State as well. But upstate, we're the predominant gun rights organization. We do lobbying, we go to Albany, we look at the legislation, we draw up positions, we make arguments. People may say that, you know, here in New York State, with the Democrats controlling everything, including the state Senate, sort of now, that we can't really be effective. But, you know, sometimes logic actually works. You know, that the COBIS, the Combined Something Ballistic Identification System, was a system kind of like micro-stamping, if you're familiar with that, and that they basically would attempt to match, you know, the bullet to the gun, and they try to use that to solve crimes. And it never solved any crimes, and it just cost a whole ton of money. And every year we just kept, you know, making that position to the legislature and saying, this has solved no crimes, this costs money. And then actually, to his credit, Governor Cuomo proposed getting rid of it in the 2012 budget because they were looking to save money, and, you know, we were right. It was a complete waste of money. It did nothing at all. And so reason actually prevailed. And, you know, that's happened. You know, you have to make the argument. You know, you can't just go out and say, you know, we support the Second Amendment, you know, this is, the Second Amendment is my gun permit, you know, and it's, you know, good for everything. I mean, it feels good to say that, and, you know, I believe that to some extent. You know, I don't know if we go into like nuclear weapons and stuff like that. We can make different arguments there, but you know, that's not going to fly if you actually want to convince people. You know, you need to have these reasoned arguments. You need to make reasoned arguments. It's not enough just to show up and yell and protest, and that's what S.C.O.P.E. does. We actually go through and we enumerate why people should support or oppose a bill, and we give very reasoned arguments as to, you know, why people should take that course of action. And if you understand politics, you know, that gives politicians cover. You know, that gives them, because they have to go to the people that vote and say, you know, not the Second Amendment is my gun permit and that's all I need. You know, that works for us. That doesn't work for the other people they're going to vote for. And we give them the, you know, the arguments that they can then use not only with their colleagues but with their constituents to say, well, this is why. It's a waste of money. It never solves any crime. And, you know, that, so on and so forth for the other issues. So obviously the big ticket item here with the Second Amendment is the New York SAFE Act. You know, it was passed literally in the middle of the night, no input, you know, no input from the county sheriffs. Like, the County Sheriffs Association has unanimously voted to oppose this legislation. They agree that it will not solve any crimes, it will not prevent violence. Mental health professionals have, you know, said that they were locked out, and the actual effect of this is that people are not going to seek treatment. They're not going to seek treatment because they're afraid that their rights are going to be taken away. And, you know, if people had actually asked professionals in the mental health community about the effects of this, they would know that. I mean, it actually specifically in the law compels them to, if they think there's any potential problem, they have any vague suspicion, the law requires them to report that to New York State. Whether it's in their exercise of professional judgment, it's necessary or not, or whether it might actually deter people from seeking treatment. It doesn't give them that option. It puts them on the hook if there's a problem. And, you know, it's like that all down the line. They didn't listen to gun owners either. They said, oh, well, we're gonna limit magazines to the capacity of 7 rounds. And this, you know, they don't make 7-round magazines for these weapons. You know, they don't make 7-round magazines for all these guns, and it's just a de facto ban. And, you know, we could have told them that if they just had, you know, the normal 3-day period for reviewing the legislation. We could look at it and said, that makes no sense at all. You know, they could have not realized that they were inadvertently not exempting law enforcement from the part where it says you can't carry on school grounds. And so theoretically, if you've got someone there shooting at kids, it's illegal for the police to go there armed and try to stop them. So, I mean, this just really was just a horrible piece of legislation that was passed with no regard for its practical application. And so now we're, I guess, at the point where people are saying you can have 10-round magazines, but you only load 7 rounds in there. Because obviously, if you plan on going on a shooting spree, you know, you're going to make sure not to load rounds 8, 9, and 10 in there, just to be on the safe side. You know, it just doesn't make any sense at all. And so that's the big challenge. And I think, you know, I don't want to exactly thank Cuomo for this, but, you know, S.C.O.P.E. is, you know, disappointed in the Republican Party. If you look at page 14 on this newsletter that I passed out, it's an article that I wrote called "Can Gun Owners Gain a Ballot Line in 2014?" I mean, you don't have to read it right now, but it basically lays out the argument that the Republicans caved on this, and the Conservative Party wasn't there. I mean, the Conservative Party, you know, they chose to focus on social issues. I mean, they were, you know, on the subject of gay marriage. They thought, well, this is a reason that we're going to go after the Republicans that voted for gay marriage, and we're going to take them down. And as a result, they lost the majority in the state Senate. And they were, you know, granted, like a whole bunch of them caved, but I mean, if they had a solid majority in the state Senate to block legislation like the SAFE Act, things might have gone better for us. So, you know, that was a very short, you know, it's just, you know, the Conservative Party's goals are not in the right place with regard to the Second Amendment. And if they can't count on the Republican Party and they can't count on the Conservative Party, well, why not the Libertarian Party? You know, and if there's got to be like 50,000 pissed off gun owners in this state, you know, and if they vote Libertarian, then, you know, we have that ballot line the same way the Conservative Party can go and like sabotage the Republicans if they don't want to, you know, support their issues. Well, we can do the same thing. And, you know, that, I think, is something that we should really consider, because, you know, I urge, like, the way they're supporting us and S.C.O.P.E. is supporting us, I think that we should support S.C.O.P.E. And we definitely need more libertarian-leaning people. We need more young people in S.C.O.P.E. I mean, I'll be honest with you, it's a bunch of old guys, like, that are not, you know, not always the most sensitive people in the political discourse, and they tend to kind of alienate people, and I've got to deal with that sometimes. And, you know, that makes life a little more difficult for me than it has to be. So I certainly would like, you know, a little more libertarian-leaning people, a little more variety in the organization. But yeah, I mean, that's, I think, the basics of S.C.O.P.E., the basics of, you know, where we're going and why they support the Libertarian Party and why we should support them. And I promised you I wouldn't ramble on, but I will take questions if you've got me.
How do you respond to people that say the purpose of the Second Amendment was for the establishment of militia, and why private gun owners need to have guns because they're not a militia?
Well, you know, fortunately, the Supreme Court in D.C. versus Heller took care of that and said it was an individual right. I mean, I wish they had made a stronger ruling on that, but they, you know, they just wanted to establish very basic principles. You know, but if you read the ruling, it really goes into great detail about the anti-federalists and the reasons that they wanted the Second Amendment in here, and it was so that you could not have a select militia that could take away the people's rights. They wanted everybody to be able to have a weapon, to form their own militia, not just what the government said the militia was, the select militia, such as a standing army or a state militia, because that could be used to take away people's rights. It could be used to, I mean, we in America, we don't think that, tomorrow our leaders are going to suspend the elections on some pretext and say, we serve for life. But it happens in other countries, and it can happen here. And one of the reasons that it hasn't happened here is that so many people have guns. I mean, you've got to put yourself in the mindset of like a dictator, right? Or somebody that wants to be a dictator. You say, okay, let's see, there's 70 million people in this country that own guns, and we have an army of 1 million. Well, that's not going to work too well, especially since, you're going to make it, and people ask that. They say, our government has tanks and airplanes and helicopters and all this stuff, and so is it really going to work? And yeah, because if you put people in the position of having to fight their fellow citizens and having to fight their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, they're going to be reluctant to do that. If there is no chance of resistance and it's just hopeless, it makes it a lot easier to comply with that kind of order. Than if you actually have to, put your sights on somebody and shoot them. And, police departments would fall on both sides of the issue, I think. There's definitely, there's people in our armed forces who have pledged, that the oath that they took to defend the Constitution includes not firing on American citizens, the Oath Keepers. There's, and you've got to look at all the miles of roads and railways in this country. We don't have enough tanks to cover them all. Where, that would have to be covered by light infantry, and that's where citizens could fight back. I mean, the Germans in World War II had tremendous problems with trying to control the roads and the railways. Yes?
2 comments and a question. One comment was, if I recall correctly, if in the case of emergency, or national emergency, FEMA takes over and the Constitution is suspended, which goes right into what you were just saying a second ago in terms of putting the Constitution aside. So it's not that far-fetched.
Right. We don't really know what the FEMA camps are for.
Well, no, it's not the FEMA camps, but the legislation for FEMA is that in a national emergency, FEMA can override Congress.
Yeah. Well, that I would say is, it's drifting off into other subjects. I would say a law like that.
But in terms of something supporting what you were saying about the government possibly, waving away an election and saying we're in for life, and just what you were saying again, soldiers, during the Occupy movement were there defending the protesters against the cops. You can see films of it there in New York City and other places. A question that I have, and it's one out of ignorance. And ignorance is correctable by knowledge. How would you balance the right to own a firearm of any sort versus being able to handle it safely and in a responsible manner?
Personal responsibility.
I'm asking this because some of those legislation and regulations, correct me if I'm wrong, are there to help hopefully do this, so if someone who buys a firearm will have some knowledge of it, and if I'm wrong with that, please correct me.
I think that's, I think that a firearm is much more useful if you know how to use it. What I would say is, I think there's 2 things. Is that one is that the misuse of firearms, accidents, don't really happen all that often. People are naturally concerned that, they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot.
It gets a lot of press, though, but it doesn't actually happen in reality as much as we think it does.
But I think the more important thing is the culture of responsibility. There was a time when children would go to school with rifles, and it would be a sport, like football. And they would just shoot at a range. And they'd show the rifle to their teacher, and he's like, oh, that's really nice. And there was no problem, because they were taught from an early age that it was a tool, and that you had to respect it, and that you had to use it safely. And it was not something that you would use to hurt somebody, unless, there were very dire circumstances. And, I think when people are not raised to think that way, and then, you know, they're a lot more likely to misuse it. They're you know, obviously they're not trained in safety, they're more likely to do something unsafe, but they're also more likely to consider it as something like, you know, that gets them respect from other people, you know, as a weapon that they can use if they feel that they are marginalized, and this is the way that they gain respect, and they gain standing in society. And if we train, and you know, if we taught them the right way to think about firearms, they were less likely to be able to step into that mold, which I think encourages criminal activity. So that's how I would answer that. Yes.
I think I can address this a little bit. But first off, the kids who took guns to school mostly took them to school because they hunted on the way home. They just needed the gun when they needed that, so they brought the gun to school and then they hunted on the way home. To address your question, I think traditionally, at least, there's been the difference between guns you had in the home and being allowed to carry them in public. That pretty much, if it was for your home use, you know, for in your home safety, that was pretty unregulated. But if you were going to carry on public, then there were classes, and you had to get a background check, and so that was held to a higher level, where that's the sort of thing that you're worried about.
Well, it's not so much worry, but, you know, just trying to find a balance in there between Second Amendment, which I firmly believe is what we need, versus, you know, I guess comes down to responsibility.
So would S.C.O.P.E. Support legislation to require licensing, like we do for driver's licenses, before you can drive a car on the street?
No, no. I mean, I think that.
But you're okay with carry permits?
The way that the permits are issued, I think, is in New York State, and we're actually signed on to a lawsuit to challenge this in New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. It's just basically arbitrary and capricious. Like a judge could deny you a permit for any reason. I mean, we would support something like...
Right, it shouldn't be arbitrary.
Right,
It
we
isn't a
support
scope
something
position
like,
that carry permits in and of themselves are unreasonable.
No, because we don't want people who have committed violent crimes to have weapons. We don't want people that are really, you know, cannot understand the consequences of their actions, or are unable to perceive other people as fellow human beings, which unfortunately, you know, some people have that problem. We don't want them to have weapons, and there should be a mechanism in place where, you know, if you have a history of beating people up, you can't have a gun. So that's not a problem. You know, the problem is in the way it's assigned. I mean, the problem with, in general, giving the government too much power to permit is that, you know, one of the reasons we have the Second Amendment is to fight a tyrannical government. And if the government chooses who gets to have the weapons, then that just doesn't work too well. Because, you know, if you give them a lot of discretion, and, you know, in New York it's just good moral character. If a judge thinks that you don't have good moral character, then that's it. I mean, that's the end of the story. You can try filing an Article 78 proceeding, which is general official misconduct, but you're not going to get very far. There's no appeals process. The judge doesn't like you, boom, you're done. And that's a problem. That's something that we would not support, because it's just arbitrary. You know, it's you know, it's in, there's, I don't know, I don't want to ramble on too much. I could draw like parallels with the First Amendment and how, you know, if there's two people that want to occupy the park at the same time, you've got to have some means of facilitating it. You know, like the government, in the sense we would view permits as facilitating the exercise of your rights rather than regulating it, if that makes sense. But any other questions? Yeah.
Well, just some comments too. And the reason we have the Second Amendment is so that we can have the rest of our rights along with the Constitution, because if we don't have guns, we're not going to be able to maintain our freedoms of speech and all the other things we're granted. One of the later amendments also gave the powers to the Congress and Senate to recruit any males and females from 17 to 45 to help out with a crisis in case we were invaded. It would be nice if they handled guns and knew how to use a gun so they could actually defend our country in time of need. So it's not only the Second Amendment, there's some later amendments. I was just reading that over the weekend that gave them the authority. And as far as Second Amendment, it says shall not be infringed. And every time you put a layer, an application, a federal permit, a transfer letter saying that Chris sold me a gun, and it just adds so many layers of infringement on the Second Amendment that I don't think was intended. We shouldn't be about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, regulation in the sense that we know it today was not existent back then. By, well-regulated militia, they meant regular, they meant training, they meant knowing how to use it, not that the government had
And
to
the leader,
be
like, some guy who was a retired colonel from the Army was, training the militia to use tactical maneuvers or how to, fight a war and communicate with each other. So it's all well intended.
Yeah. Yes, Max.
I don't know if it's on the books anymore, but an interesting note about as far as what the founders regarded as the well-regulated militia. Prior to the Constitution, New York State passed a law defining a militia as all able-bodied male citizens 16 through 44 years of age.
That's correct.
Has S.C.O.P.E pushed back at all on Scouts with his vote on stealing our Second Amendment rights?
Well, we've certainly we've sent out emails notifying people of what happened. Right now, with regard to the budget process, we have another communication that's scheduled to go out. We're not happy, and this may surprise people who think that we're just pig-headed right-wing conservative people that blindly follow authority. As we don't support the law enforcement exemption, we believe that everyone should have an exemption. We don't believe that just because you're a police officer, a retired police officer, that you somehow have different rights than the rest of us. And so we're kind of upset that the Republicans put in the law enforcement exemption instead of saying, well, no, we're not going to do the law enforcement exemption. You're going to exempt everybody because this is an embarrassment for Cuomo. And they could have just stood their ground and say, no, it's everybody or nothing.
Right.
And they didn't do that.
Well,
so
I know,
we're going to mention that to people.
I know I personally had pledged to donate to the state Republican Party, and I've sent them a letter saying, forget it. You didn't uphold your pledge to me, I will not uphold my pledge to you. And as far as I'm concerned, Skelos is a traitor, and he should be impeached. He should step down at the very least. I'm really fed up with these people. Another question I have is, how does S.C.O.P.E view registering our guns? And what's their stance on that?
We oppose registration. Registration has historically always led to confiscation. It's happening right in California. They have used these lists and then gone and changed the laws and send the police around to confiscate weapons. They're doing it right now.
And then every time confiscation has happened, what takes place after? Every single time. Anyone? In every Western country that gun confiscation has ever happened in, what has happened? Every single time.
The government starts killing people.
Exactly. Every time. It's happened
Russia,
in the last
China.
100 years.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about, I would hesitate to say,
What about
I
Canada?
mean, you'd have
full
to include like
disarmament.
Canada,
I mean, full
Australia.
disarmament.
It hasn't happened yet anyway, but yeah, I mean, in governments, they tend to do that. Like, I hate using the example of the Nazis because everyone has that like Nazi comparison and people get all emotional about it, so I prefer the Soviet Union, which is just as good an example. They fought a revolution, and then the government said, okay, turn in your guns, the revolution's over now, and you don't need them anymore. And that was a big mistake. And it's happened, everywhere that happens. Yeah, everywhere that confiscation happens, it's just inevitable. Because, you're not always going to have the right people in office. I mean, power attracts the corruptible. And, it may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow, but if you don't have safeguards in place, then it's sooner or later you will lose your rights. It's just, it's necessary. That's why we have the First Amendment, that's why we have the Second Amendment, that's why we have all the amendments.
Great. So,
So-
thank you, Chris. Thank you, Christopher Edes, for coming to speak to us.